Hello and welcome to episode 118 of Stand Up with Pete Dominick. Joining me today, the great Laura Coates, and investigative journalist and author of the new book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, Katherine Stewart. I'm Pete Dominick. It's time to stand up with me right now. Well, hello, my friends, and thank you very much for checking me out today here on the podcast. And anytime you can, thank you very, very much to all of the new subscribers and all of the longtime subscribers of this podcast, which we started back in November. Lots of new people signing up and lots of people joining me, almost 50 people joining me on a Zoom chat last night. And it was exhilarating. It was energizing. It was positive. It was real. It was honest. We had, I think, 4 women of color in there, and they did a lot of the talking, and the rest of us really did a lot of listening. And it was magical and exhilarating to have this community. And I highly recommend that you join that community by signing up for a paid subscription for as little as $5. I mean, even if it's just to be in those Zoom chats, which I'm going to be doing hopefully at least once a week, if not more, because connecting with people from all over the country and all different backgrounds and walks of life is really special. And whether we admit it or not, a lot of us don't have a huge local network or, a lot of friends, period. And this community for the podcast is that. It really is. People are connecting with each other in a unique and special way. And I highly recommend that you sign up for a subscription. Just for that reason alone, you can go to the paid subscription here in the show link and sign up. And it's also patreon.com/Pete Dominick. Okay, that's all I got to say. It's late. I got to get to bed. I got to get up and do yoga early with my wife, and maybe you'll join us for that. But a lot is going on in the world. It's absolutely chaotic in so many ways, but we're going to slow it down here on today's podcast. I've got a great conversation coming right now with Laura Coates, and then another one with Katherine Stewart, who's an investigative journalist. Been already a great week of guests, and it's only a Wednesday. So Laura is an old friend of mine, and I don't know what to tell you about her other than she's probably one of my all-time favorite people. You can hear her on SiriusXM 10 to noon every day, channel 126. You can see her all the time on CNN, where she is a legal correspondent. For years, she worked for the federal government in both the Obama and Bush administration in the Department of Justice, and she prosecuted some pretty heinous crimes, sex crimes against children and worse. We touch on that a little bit. She's a professor. She's a Princeton grad. She's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met in my life, and she also happens to be really funny and thoughtful, and she's one of my best friends, I gotta say. She's on Twitter at the Laura Coates, Coates with an E. She's from Minneapolis, and we talk about how she went back there this week to visit the site and talk to the people in her community and report for CNN, where George Floyd was killed. Amazing conversation with Laura Coates. Really excited that I finally got her for a longer conversation. Here it is right now. Ladies and gentlemen, I finally got her back. She's very, very busy. Look at who it is. It's the great Laura Coates, everybody. The Laura Coates.
Did you almost forget my name for a second?
No.
Like, it's the...
I paused because I wasn't recording on the Zoom. I was only recording on the audio, so I took a long pause.
Oh, okay.
For technical reasons. So happy to see you and to have you on the podcast. And do you want to make small talk or not?
I mean, I can small talk with you all day. I love it. I know. You little guys were really good friends, Pete. I think it's hilarious.
What's funny is the more well-known you have gotten, the more likely I am to mention that we're good friends. It's so transparent.
Is that what that float was above my house? Oh, okay.
It's so every time you're on TV, I tweet, well, we're good friends, So first of all, a lot of people might not know this about you. A lot of people might not know. You are from Minneapolis. And of course, they've had more problems than just George Floyd with the police there. But who's from Minneapolis? Let's start there. How did you?
You know what? I was, the funny story of how I ended up in the Twin Cities generally, we were living in Worcester, Massachusetts, and until I was about 7 or 8 years old. And then my father turns to my mother and says, I'm tired of living here. You know, he was from Worcester. And my mother and him met when they were in college and at, you know, Amherst and Smith. And we had been in New England, and my mom was from Connecticut and we have North Carolina, et cetera. And he just turns to her one day and says, I want to leave. I think I want to move someplace else. You feel like moving? And she goes, yeah, let's go somewhere. Where should we go? And my dad says, how about this? Let's turn on the television, and whatever television show is on, wherever it's based, we'll go there. And I swear to God, Mary Tyler Moore was on. Mary Tyler Moore was in Minneapolis. My parents looked at it and said, it's a sign. Okay, we'll do that. We ended up moving a few months later. And I was there when I was about 8 years old, and is there ever since up through to when I went for college. And so for me, all the time I think of my childhood and my life was moving to St. Paul, Minnesota. You know, I went to school in Jersey, but I came back to Minnesota for law school. I was at a law firm in Minneapolis. I bought my first house. I mean, I had this chance to, as this single woman, and had to do the whole 100 different times sign. Yes, I'm sure I'm buying this house. Yes, I don't have a husband. Yes, it's what. Yes, I am dating. It's a Sex and the City episode where Miranda does it. And my house that I first bought out there was in Minneapolis, right across from the bridge where my parents are, because the Twin Cities are so close together. I mean, it's like the Mississippi River, divides it. The house I bought in Minneapolis was maybe 2 miles from where my parents' house is in St. Paul. And so it was a perfect home for me. Loved the neighborhood, loved the community, loved being there. 4 blocks from where that house is, George Floyd was killed. 4 blocks. I mean, you're talking about places I have gone and frequented. The grocery store I went to was the Cub Foods across from the precinct that was burned down and destroyed. The Target that I shopped at, that's the Target that was burned. The area entirely is one that's so familiar to me that it was almost surreal, Pete, when I saw that there was not only a continuous string of officer-involved killings of unarmed Black men, from Jamar Clark to Philando Castile to now George Floyd, that it takes on this sort of disorienting quality. You know what I mean? You know it happens. And of course, I know the injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And I understand that inequality is like air pollution, not recognizing or respecting boundaries. And why shouldn't my hometown be a place where this happens? I know why it shouldn't, but it's not as if it's too close to home. It has no right to happen here. I'm somehow should be immune from it, or people in Minnesota. And you feel like that with every place you are. And, it used to be that Minneapolis and St. Paul were kind of punchlines for people, referencing Rose Nyland of Golden Girls, right? Or they talk about Prince is the only person from there. And it was not shocking that no one ever thought I was from Minnesota, because they have this vision of the demographics of what Minnesota is like, and that it's going to be an all white state with no diversity whatsoever. And the thought is, if there's no perceived diversity, then there must not be inequality. But that is not the case there. And now going from being synonymous with Prince and Kirby Puckett and the Mall of America, now it is synonymous with this tremendous tragedy. And it's difficult to orient yourself.
I have a billion questions for you. First of all, you said I went to school in Jersey. Of course, that was Princeton, but you just didn't say
Isn't that Jersey?
It's just weird. I mean, I would always say, if I went to Princeton, I'd work it into any conversation. Number 2, I don't believe your story that your parents so irresponsibly moved to a random place. It sounds.
They did.
It doesn't sound like a responsible choice at all. I mean, what they didn't know anything about it, and they just moved there based on TV show.
They moved there because it was where the coincidence was. That year, it happened to have been ranked they have those rankings of the best places in the country to live.
Well, you left that out. That's important.
My father is a solo practitioner and a dentist, and just said he could move his practice. My mom, I think back, my parents were probably in their early 30s around this time, and I think back, thank God they were sort of irresponsible in that, so to speak, and that they gave that because it was a great place to grow up. I mean, it was a place. I mean, we joke around in college when people would ask where I was from, and I'd talk about my life. You know, really, we called it Mayberry. I mean, my father's dental office was 3 or 4 blocks from our house. When I wanted to go to the movie theater, I'd go up the street. My dad used to do a lot of work with, obviously dental work, but he also is somebody who began working in prisons. And so he's always been civic-minded and public service-oriented. So if you didn't have the money, I remember growing up to do dental work and have it done and this extensive, things he could do, he would kind of make a deal with you and say, you know what, I know you can't afford this right now. You own a movie theater, right? Well, you know what? I love the movies. My kids love the movies. When they come, let them in. And so I would go to the movie theater in my neighborhood up the street, and I'd walk in, and Mr. Lou, and I'd say, "Oh, hi, Mr. Lou. I know there's a matinee today. Can we go in? Of course, come on in." That's the kind of place that I grew up.
I could see you as a little girl, like using that somewhere and be like, "Come on, man, I want that dress, or I want that toy, whatever it is," and negotiating with the store and be like, "Listen, your teeth are looking a little bit. Do you have any pain?"
No, I didn't exploit it. I did do my fair share of movies, but I will note that although we got in for free, when we asked for popcorn, I wasn't allowed to have the shiny red and white bag or bucket. I had to have a paper bag one, which I've always taken an issue with, but that's fine. It was a free movie.
So what were the racial demographics like growing up, or what was your, did you have any issues? Were there a lot of problems growing up?
Well, I don't think there is a woman of color or a person of color in this country who could honestly look you in the eye and say, I never encountered racial inequity. Everyone always treated me fairly, and no one ever regarded the color of my skin as some reason to doubt me or withhold the benefit of the doubt or make me prove some aspect of my mind or intelligence or patriotism. That has happened throughout the country, and it's certainly the case with me. The demographics have always, there are minorities in our country. African Americans are an extraordinary minority when it comes to Minnesota. But it's also a place where it's known to be quite progressive to many. There's a lot of people who are from there who are African American, who are from Minnesota, but there's a lot of people who are coming from places like Detroit and Chicago and Milwaukee, all around that area, coming up from New Orleans, coming up in different areas. There are East Coast and West Coast
refugees
people
too.
As well. A lot of refugees. There's a huge, we have in Minnesota the largest population of Somalis outside of Mogadishu. We have a huge Laotian population. There is obviously a Native American population. It is a very diverse place unexpectedly to many people. But although it's so far above the Mason-Dixie line, of course, talking about the North Star state, which conjures up images of, to the extent that people were, escaping slavery, they were using the North Star and trying to get as close to Canada as they could. People, think about the influence of, say, Dred Scott or other really pioneering figures in the abolitionist movement. And they all have some ties in many ways to places like Minnesota or the way in which they were treated in the Midwest. But unlike places below the Mason-Dixie line, unlike places traditionally known to be part of the Jim Crow South, where there'd be proactive measures in response to a presence of Black people in this country, ways in which to withhold certain benefits, ways in which to have redlining, trying to remove people from certain areas. Minnesota, unfortunately, also has a history where they were preemptively doing these things, where redlining was not in reaction to an existing population, but in anticipation that there one day would be. So you did have covenants, you did have these sorts of things happening. And also, almost 100 years ago, almost to the date of George Floyd being killed in Minneapolis, it was almost the anniversary for the lynching of 3 Black men in Duluth. And those 3 men were actually in police custody at the time that a mob came and took them. They were accused of having looked at or in some way spoken to a white woman. A mob came and got them. They were lynched. In reaction to that, there was advocacy organizations, in particular a Black woman, who advocated for a legislative change to ensure that police officers would be accountable for anyone in their custody, that they would not be able to allow a lynch mob or otherwise to harm anyone in their custody. That was about 100 years ago. And so the irony of watching now Mr. George Floyd in custody of police and having officers look away while one is taking action is something that almost paralyzes you in trying to assess, progress. And on the other hand, the city of St. Paul, where I'm from, it was in the 90s when the Supreme Court, there's a really famous case called RAV versus City of St. Paul. And in that case, there was a cross that was burned on the lawn of a Black family in St. Paul. They caught the people who did it. They were prosecuted under a statute that said, as you would guess, one cannot behave in this manner. You can't engage in discriminatory actions like this and being bigoted and targeting people. Well, those criminals appealed the conviction and appealed and said, hold on a second, this statute that says you can't discriminate against people, essentially, that's way too broad. And frankly, it looks as though you're only punishing people who have discriminatory viewpoints, not just general speech restrictions. The Supreme Court took it up. Justice at the time, Antonin Scalia, was the one to write the opinion. This is a time when the woman on the court alone was not Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Sotomayor. It was Sandra Day O'Connor, right, who was the only woman on the Supreme Court. And she said, and Scalia said, hold on a second. We think Minnesota's gone too far. They've gone too far in trying to stifle discrimination and silence a sort of bigoted speech. And it's not content neutral. It doesn't say that you can't generally, you're basically only harming people who and targeting people and punishing people who have a certain ideology. So you think to yourself, well, don't we want jurisdictions to silence that sort of, discriminatory conduct? Well, the Supreme Court said we do theoretically, but the way you've done it, you've gone too far. And so reason I bring these points up, Pete, is because on the one hand, you've got, this history dating back even 100 years ago. And you have the idea of there being some legislative action being taken to stop discrimination at different points throughout Minnesota's history. And yet, you still, in 2020, have similar conduct and people questioning speech going too far, right, and the officers being accountable. And it's surreal. And
did you say in that case that someone had a cross burnt on their lawn?
On their lawn. This is the 90s.
That's trespassing, and that's vandalism, and it's terrorism.
There's so many aspects of it that are, and of course, what the Supreme Court is focusing on was the actual ordinance in St. Paul that said, essentially, you can't engage in this behavior. And, it's kind of interesting because when people think about the First Amendment, they automatically think about speech, right? And they may think about that old saying of, I may not agree with you, but I'll fight like hell to give you the chance to say it. Right. And they remember a neighboring state, in Skokie, Illinois, when you had even the ACLU Nazis supporting and not supporting the ideology, but supporting the notion that there could be a Nazi parade down the street because they said, look, you can't make rules targeting the content of the speech. You have to across the board. If you got a rule regulation, fine. If you got to have a permit to have a parade, fine. If you got to only protest between 7 a.m. and 10:30 p.m., fine. But it's got to apply to everyone. And so the idea that a state that the Supreme Court said just a couple decades ago went too far to stop discrimination, look where we are today with this confluence of all these things.
Yep. Great historical perspective as it relates specifically to Minneapolis. So, before you were a rich and famous commentator, an analyst.
When's that happening? Oh.
Stop.
Is that coming?
Stop it. Who's bigger than you? Before
I'm in a T-shirt. What do you call him big?
A T-shirt that you got, as I know as a fact, because I got one too. As a freebie, because you have your own radio show at SiriusXM and Why Hunger partners with them, and that's what that T-shirt's from. I have the same one.
In other words, I'm cheap.
if you say so. I don't know.
I buy swag. I don't spend money. I get swag.
I've seen what you wear. I don't think you're cheap, unless you're somehow using your father's dental practice to get some of the duds that you wear on TV. So, but before you were a rich and famous commentator, TV, radio person, you were a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice during Bush and Obama. And more importantly, for my question, you were an assistant United States attorney for the District of Columbia, where you prosecuted all kinds of different crimes, violent felonies, drug trafficking, domestic violence. And you and I don't think we ever talked about it on the air, but I know we talked about it off the air, as well as child abuse and sexual assault, which someday, if you haven't talked about it, I'd love to hear, as painful as that is, for you to discuss. But my question is about, based on the fact that you had all that credibility and all that experience, what was your relationship like as a United States attorney with law enforcement? You had to work directly with them, didn't you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, honestly,
you must have the most nuanced, thoughtful opinion about all of what is happening based on that. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, thank you. I got to tell you, my interaction with officers is, from different perspectives. One as a Black woman, one as a civil rights prosecutor, and one as somebody who had to work in tandem with police officers to ensure that we got justice for a variety of families in the community and on behalf of the United States. And I can tell you that my relationship and interaction with officers was overwhelmingly positive in the cases I worked. Why? Because there was a vested and shared interest, particularly in some of the most affected groups. You're talking about the sexual assault of sometimes infants and beyond. You're talking which makes people's stomachs turn, and it should. You're talking about pedophilia. You're talking about sexual assault and the abuse of elderly and drug crimes. You're talking about violent crimes, including so many where, multiple groups of people savagely attacking a bystander or someone that they think they know. And so largely the cases, particularly in those instances, you don't have the backdrop of the quote unquote bad apples. You don't have the idea of excessive force being used to arrest the people. You don't have Fourth Amendment implications in terms of the encounter. You have them come up about gathering evidence later on and about a chain of custody. But overwhelmingly in those cases, everyone's on the same team and the person is being identified and brought to you through the arraignment and grand jury process, as opposed to what we're seeing about the officer-involved encounters. So for that reason, a lot of my experiences were positive and collegial because we were fighting for the same instance and I wasn't questioning the behavior. And those are the woman cases. There were, however, many cases where I would have to ask the officer, when they would tell me something that sounded too precisely like a script. When it came time for things like, here's how I found the gun. Here's why, this person looks injured when they're in the booking photo. Here's why, here's where I found the drugs. And after a while, you think to yourself, well, God, that sounds like a precise script that I've heard from 4 officers today, let alone this week. And you had to start to have a healthy skepticism because officers are well trained to know that there are Supreme Court precedent-based cases that allow them to get a hyper benefit of the doubt. If I say this, then I'm cleared in this area. If there is a furtive gesture made towards a waistband, well, there's some Supreme Court cases. If I'm in a high crime area and the suspect took flight, the more that it sounds like police-ese and legalese, the more you have to question to ensure that somebody's Fourth Amendment rights were not, compromised. Or they may say things like, I was able to detect, I smelled drugs on this person. And you'd say, oh, you did. And where did you actually locate the drugs? They were inside of a crevice inside of their buttocks. Really? And you just happen to walk by and smell that. I know it sounds graphic and vulgar, but that's the kind of things you question and say, well, how did that happen? How did that take place? What circumstances were you able to now realize and identify or notice that there may have been a small zip located in somebody's underwear? And so you have to realize that when you stand up and you are on behalf of the United States of America, guess who you also represent? The person that's been arrested. And as much as officers work in connection with prosecutors, the prosecutor has a different role, and it's more expansive. It is one that has to consider that everyone could be telling you a story as opposed to the truth. So when and you add on top of that, my experience is just being a person in this society. And knowing from my civil rights background and work and being the daughter of and the wife of and now the mother of Black men, you think about this and say, that whole idea of you have to fully compartmentalize and just be dismissive and think about anomalies just doesn't ring true for me. And then I look at it, of course. I was actually playing on the show today. I was playing Chris Rock, and he had this great stand-up piece, Pete. I'm sure you know, you're a phenomenal comedian, about bad apples. And I think to myself, the way in which the National Security Advisor has made comments about it, other people have talked about it. In what other world, Pete, would it be okay for there to be a few people who do the wrong thing? And why is it that we are allowing, you mentioned a prosecutor. The very reason I was a prosecutor, the very reason our prosecutors exist, the very reason that there's a Department of Justice, the very reason we have an executive branch that's charged with enforcing the law is because we have always, since the beginning of our society, planned for bad apples in every context. We don't hope people will be law-abiding. We may hope they're law-abiding, or we plan for them not to be.
I think that the bad apple argument is different when it's public versus private organization. So it's just far worse if you work for the government, if you're a teacher, if you are a police officer, a firefighter, or a public defender, if you work for the government, there's a higher standard and we're paying your salary. That's the way I look at this. Like, it's not like criticizing a bad apple at a bank or at a retailer or something like that, a hairdresser. It's like, I don't care. They're going to go out. They'll go out of business if they're bad apples, if they have a bad reputation, that's not always the truth, obviously. But the problem I see in policing in America is that, this is easy to say for those of us who aren't cops, but listen, you're all bad apples if you're not turning in the bad apple. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept and all of that. I've always believed that. But the more I've learned about it and talked to police officers, the truth is, if you do turn in a bad cop, you are fucked. They will completely minimize you in that department. You are a rat. You are a snitch. They will make your life hell to the point you feel unsafe or you quit. That seems to be police culture. You can't be someone who does the right thing and turns in the bad cops, or else you have crossed that blue line. How much truth is there to that?
Well, different degrees of it. Yes, there is that blue wall. There is the idea of, just like I'm sure people in the military feel when you have to be in a profession and you choose the profession and have this, the weight of public service. If you can't believe that somebody is going to have your back if you speak up, and you're in these very difficult, often violent interactions, there is a level of self-preservation that they claim to feel just to exist and function on the job. On the other hand, there are many instances of officers who are aware of that fear, and they can still act to deter before it gets to the filing a complaint. For example, in this case of George Floyd, if the blue wall of silence exists, fine. For them, maybe they mean, I won't turn you in for what you've done. But why not remove his knee? Why not tell him, all right, he can't breathe, back up? Why not, at the very least, say, I got it from here? Why not, at the very least, and there was footage that came out yesterday of an officer, and I'm going to try to remember where exactly it was, but there was an officer who saw another officer. It was a on Twitter, I saw it, a video footage, and I don't know where it was, but it was the officer who put his knee on.
I saw that. And the other officer pulled his knee off of him.
Yes. And there was another one where a black woman, she knocked that and she pulled him. So that's real time.
Police officer knocked a black woman who had her hands up down. And then a black female police officer really went after him, and you could see her just screaming at him. And, you know, it's nice to see, Laura, that in the moment someone will correct a colleague. But that's
not enough. It's not enough.
I'm guessing that doesn't happen as much after after it happens, or if it's not caught on camera.
Well, I agree with that, and I'm not at all saying that this is the only solution. But there are people who in the moment act to intervene, which is why in Minneapolis, in fact, in a place across the country, there have been police manuals that actually codify this, because they know it doesn't always happen. In Minneapolis, following the shooting of Jamar Clark, who was in this very different state of facts that were said there, but after he was shot, they changed the police manual to say you had a duty to intervene, which is probably the reason that the police chief acted so swiftly to fire all of the people. However, it's not legislated. This is it's in an actual policy, it's in a rule training manual, not an actual legislative or criminal code.
Right.
And so I agree with you when I hear that there is a blue wall of silence. There are instances where people are fired for the behavior they're engaged in. A camera and magnified with the eyes of the globe watching accelerates it, but it's no match, nor is it the pure holistic remedy that's needed as a case by case. Anytime we're operating in the world of a case by case, let's wait and see, reactive as opposed to proactive, you stunt and even paralyze progress. And so the blue code of silence is real. I mean, I don't think I've heard from the Fraternal Order of Police, right? I don't think we've heard some major statement about
Don't hold your breath.
I don't think, I don't think we'll hear a lot. We didn't hear from, the Department of Justice expressly pointing this out, that there is an issue. And so the Rights Division, we haven't heard enough. And so, while there are cases, even though I know there needs to be a holistic approach, there are some like this one, where even without any of that, just someone saying, stop, calling the cop off, another officer, come on, stop, he can't breathe. That would have been so important.
Well, yeah, you're asking for humanity, and that doesn't seem to be too much to ask, but we need comprehensive policing reform, law enforcement reform, and there's a whole bunch of ideas out there, but to take away all the power that police have, it's just way too much power. I mean, and what plays out in these situations when they are caught on camera, and, a very small amount of them, I'm sure, are caught on camera, and the country is mostly outraged about certainly the George Floyd case. Even some of the unusual suspects seemingly are articulating, well, that seemed to be a little too much. Even Hannity's like, whoa. But what we don't have, what we see so often in a pattern is what you're an expert on here, is the trial. So let's say, this one cop is arrested. What about the rest of them? We can talk about that. But more importantly, what about this cop's trial? Too often, these people, even when there's video evidence, they get away with it. And then the protests, of course, begin again, as they should, because, no peace, no justice. No justice, no peace, rather. I mean, that I'm new to the movement, apparently. That's I suck. I went to one rally.
You were so close.
I went to one rally, and I'm like, just a white guy saying it backwards. I've got the wrong hand signal up. So but the point is, we are going to see more and more protests if there is not justice in a trial. How do we, obviously we have to look at them case by case, but how do you see this one playing out with George Floyd? It's a slam dunk for, is there even a trial? Do we have to have a jury? I mean, how can this guy plead? It's on video. It's the worst we've seen, I think.
Well, unfortunately, as long as we have a jury system in this country, and we should, it only takes one person to disrupt and make a conscious decision to take and transform an otherwise slam dunk into, a missed shot. So I always have to, pardon the pun, hold my breath a little, even on the obvious. But I will say that thinking about trials, it's not, you can't just begin with the trial and opening statements. The way trials can be most successful and convictions can be secured is through smart charging decisions. You have to have smart charging decisions, to make smart charging decisions. What I mean by that is, going forward, that at the end of it, you're going to have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. To do that, you have to think about what are the specific elements of each crime you are charging and whether you have evidence to support it. It's almost like a packing list, right? I'm going to go to this place. I'm going to go here. Do I have the bathing suit, the sunscreen? Do I have diapers for a baby? Whatever you need to have. You have your list. That's the same thing when it comes to thinking about a criminal charge. What am I actually going to match up here to make this all make sense? And so when you're building your case, you're thinking about the evidence you can put in different columns for the jury to match up. If you make a bad charging decision and don't have evidentiary support for each element of a charge, you have set yourself up for failure, period. You also create an opportunity for failure if you charge a crime that can't be proven because of some judicial opinion that's made clear what other element you have to have. So to that end, right now he has been charged, this one officer, could be more, has been charged with third-degree murder. Now in Minnesota, that means that it's an unintentional killing. You didn't intend to kill the person. However, you knew full well that your actions could kill someone. It was so foreseeable that you didn't care. You knew there was a risk and you didn't care about the risk. That's very counterintuitive to people. How can I not intend, but I intentionally disregard the risk?
Right.
How do I make those two make sense to me? So that's always a challenge. The bigger challenge, however, is when third-degree murder cases usually, Pete, you're talking about somebody maybe driving down the wrong side of the highway. Someone can get killed by this, or I shoot into a crowd of people. Someone can get killed. I know someone could die. I don't care. I'm doing it anyway. In Minnesota, those are the envisioned cases. In Minnesota, the courts have said, if, however, you are focusing all of your energy and focusing on one person in particular, then you can't reconcile the unintentional with the intent, with the foreseeable risk. Meaning, if I shoot into a crowd of people and don't target any one person, fine. If I drive down the highway and anyone could die, fine. But if I am shooting at a person in a crowd, if I have all of my energy and wrath on one person, then I'm not acting in a reckless way. The charging document is flawed. So everyone's looking at that from the public says, I can't reconcile the unintentional, the intentional. Lawyers in Minnesota and the judges in Minnesota are looking at it and say, we've already decided this issue, that third-degree murder charges really shouldn't be appropriate if you actually have a singular focus on one person, because it's too difficult to reconcile those 2 points. So you have to be able to build a case either higher than that or charge in the alternate manslaughter. So what happened with the officer,
which is a higher charge, more extreme.
Second degree murder is more serious than third degree murder.
Got it.
Manslaughter is less serious than murder. In a hierarchy of things, it's the first degree murder. Envision that being the person who I'm premeditating or I'm hiring a hitman. I have it out for you and I'm planning it to a T. That's the intentional. Second degree murder is a different level, but it's not going to be a plan. You could maybe have it in the moment, the heat of passion. I lost my mind for a second. I walked in on my husband having an affair, or someone is hurting someone else. And then on the third issue is what we're talking about now. Now, last year, and one of the things that Hennepin County attorney was saying, Pete, was, look, I was aggressive and I was able to convict, unlike many jurisdictions, an officer for excessive force on this very charge and in the same world. Well, he misses the fact that there is a different racial dynamic at play. You're talking about a Black victim. He mentioned a Somali American Black officer, Muhammad Noor, who killed a white Australian woman who had called the police, believing there was a sexual assault in progress in the alleyways behind her home. And the officer shot into the dark. That's essentially the theory of going on. And because of that, and then that was initial charge, a third degree murder. But then they found more evidence, they felt, and charged him with second degree murder. added some more information about that. He was convicted. So using that as an example shows you that even if it's an officer initially charged, I don't know how they're going to get around this judicial opinion that says, look, shooting and targeting one particular person is very different than just recklessly, without regard for human life, driving down the wrong side of the highway. So now they have Keith Ellison in. I know. I think he's been on your show before. I think I've heard him in the past.
I never talked to Keith Ellison.
Oh, really?
He's the Attorney General in Minnesota now?
Well, he should have been. He was a congressman out of Minnesota as well for years. And he, was the first African-American member of Congress from Minnesota, the first Muslim, and also the first African-American to win a statewide office in Minnesota. And by the way, I think won by more than 100,000 votes. So there's not confidence about him as Attorney General. So he has his work cut out for him to try to assess these charges, he says, with a fresh set of eyes and get over that hump, that hurdle of how do you reconcile that somebody intentionally knelt on someone's neck all this time, but did not intend what they knew could happen?
Yeah, that's a really interesting legal question. And how important is the autopsy that we now have that apparently says they call it a homicide? It was asphyxiation. I forget the technical wording of the medical examiner's report, but there are those. There's they call them. There's these two competing. I mean, I feel like the Eric Garner case. They tried to say that he had pre-existing conditions that made it. Or people even looked at it and said he was overweight or something, and they tried to blame it on something else other than him being put in a fucking chokehold. But I mean, this doesn't seem like I don't know how they could possibly explain it away. We saw the man die.
There are so many instances of victim blaming, aren't there?
There is always,
right,
in these cases, especially if it's a black person, they always blame the victim. They go, if the black, to tell you, but it's almost comical if it weren't so tragic. They go back years and find anything that they could possibly, including maybe a bad picture. He was no angel.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
They'll talk about a 50-year-old man and then talk about how in fourth grade he stole a Jolly Rancher. I mean, it really does happen. And I'm looking at a Jolly Rancher right now. But when I think about this and hear it, here's the thing. First of all, the statutes in Minnesota, as they are in many states, clearly say that the conduct has to cause the death. Okay. That's why you look to a medical examiner's determination of what caused a death. It opens the prosecution to have a stronger case. It opens the door for the defense to say, okay, well, hold on. Is that a singular cause or contributed to? What are we talking about here? The reason you're absolutely right, you're thinking about from Eric Garner and to now George Floyd, part of the medical examiner's report talks about how it was compression, the kneeling contributing to it, the idea of cutting off, when you have a cardiopulmonary, arrest, it's that their blood can't go to the heart any longer. It's constricted. The reason people, stop, when the oxygen doesn't go to the brain, because air can't go there. You have these two factors at play. They added in things like toxicology and tried to suggest that there may have been other factors. But here's the thing. If, God forbid, you shoot a woman in the heart, the medical autopsy coming back to say, well, there was a gunshot wound through the heart, but there was evidence of breast cancer tissue. Nobody would say to themselves, oh, well, then I guess it could have been the breast cancer that killed her. It could have killed her, God forbid, one day. It could be a contributing factor as to why she would need medical treatment down the road and hopefully fully recover. But to suggest that, oh, well, if there's the presence of, some sort of malignant tumor or there's cancer tissue someplace, then we really should not look at the bullet wound through the center of the heart. That's how I look at and examine, if I was the prosecutor in this case, any idea of alternate or contributing factors. Did it actually contribute, or was it simply an X-ray, essentially a scan of the body of all the things that was going on inside? I look at it more as the bullet wound through the heart versus talking about cancerous tissue in the breast. I look at it the same way when you realize that a medical examiner, their role is not to draw legal conclusions. On their report, they have clear disclaimers all the time for this reason. because we get caught up in the general public about every word, and we should. But technically, because a medical examiner says homicide on a report, it does not, in and of itself, create enough evidence to draw a conclusion about who did it, right? That's the key in criminal prosecution. And it's more so a body as an umbrella term that's used by medical examiners to simply say it was not a death caused by natural causes. It's a homicide. We've got something intervening, something caused this person to die that was not natural. Therefore, it decided to be a homicide. But it doesn't take you far enough. If you're a prosecutor, it's only one of the tools in your toolbox, only one bit of evidence that doesn't get you all the way to reasonable doubt, but it does tell you, look, those contributing factors, that tissue we're talking about, that is a light year away from the bullet hole through the heart.
Take off your legal expert hat and just be my friend Laura Coates, who is a mother and a husband. And
I'm a wife. You call me a husband.
I was like, what did I say?
We're not that good friends. Go ahead.
You are a great husband, Laura.
Thank you. My wife thinks so too.
And just tell me how you think, how does Laura Coates, how do you see where we are at right now in America with the division and the hate and the fear that we're seeing? There's protests all over the country. There's violence all over the country. The reaction to it is insane. And obviously I want to get to the president's actions and a little bit of constitutional law if we have time. But just how are you feeling? How are you seeing this? Is this different this time?
You know, it does feel different. It feels worse. You know, I never achieved what I think some people think you would about numbness, of the kind of numbness you have to have oftentimes to be able to be galvanized by something and look at it objectively. I don't think you have to be numb to be objective. I think you have to, in order to be objective, you have to feel. And when I look at what's happened, now that I'm a mother, now that my son is getting older, he's 7 years old, my daughter is 6 years old, you know, to me, it very much has always been real. And I remember, I think I told you this once, my husband was a techie guy and loves gadgets. One day, you know, comes home and he's like, I got a box ride to the house. And he goes, okay, I got to go to the car real quick. And I said, okay, fine. He goes to the car. He goes, now what? Come out in 10 minutes. I'm thinking, oh my God, when I'm watching a show. What's going on? Can I watch Real Housewives? Can I have them on? Okay, fine. I come outside in 10 minutes. And he's showing me how he set up this camera in the car. And he's like, this is, this camera, it's hanging off the rearview mirror, and here's how it works. And if it falls down, here's what you do. And it has a cord there, and it'll connect there. And if you can record this, and here's how you can view out. And here, and just only practice driving around the block for a second, Laura, because you'll see that it's not going to distract you from seeing. It's not going to restrict your view at all. And I was like, I don't need a camera in my car. What is it? I'm fine. I need a camera in the car. And he's like, well, it's not, I have the mirror. I don't know what I thought. I have this, I kept thinking that it was something about myself that he was doing this in my car.
To be a safe driver, to be a more responsible driver.
Yeah. And he's like, well, actually, maybe it's actually for me, because I want you to know what happens if I couldn't ever. I said, and I stopped, and he goes, if there's ever a moment that I'm pulled over or by police in any way for anything, I just want you to be able to know what happened. And in that moment, I had to kind of gasp for air, because this is my man in front of me. Me selfishly thinking, oh, what is this gadget he's doing to make my life easier or harder for a second? And then realizing that it was a informed fear, and almost the not acceptance, but realization that there could come a time when his wife, the mother of his children, the explainer to his two kids, would need to tell what happened. And when you have that experience in your life, and when you realize that is the conversation and the thought process going through the mind of a 30-something-year-old man, it is heartbreaking. It's scary. It's my kids asking, why do you have a camera? And wondering, do I explain? It's me going back to Minnesota and my son and daughter saying, oh, is it time for the State Fair? Why aren't we coming too? Wondering how much you tell them, wondering how much you share, wondering at what point, and how it is you ended up in this wing of the museum. Like I think about with my kids, I think all the time, I'm sure you do too, Pete. I think about like their childhood and my role of rearing them. Like I'm going through a museum, right? I'm in a museum and I want them to see all these different beautiful things all around the world. I want to take them to this wing and we'll see this part of the universe, and we'll go over this wing and I'll show them this art in this culture, and we'll go to this wing and we'll learn about music history, and we'll go to this wing and we'll experience this food culture, and we'll go to this wing and we'll have a historical moment. And you plan in your mind to go through this museum and you curate the exhibits that they see. And then one day it hits you that someone takes you, it's what it feels like. They take you from the 10th floor and they throw you into the dungeon basement and say, this is the part you teach them now. And you look around and it's oppression. You look around and it's racism. You look around and it's the part that you're supposed to tell your kid who's 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 or 7, people don't like you because of what I've told you and what I believe is beautiful. People won't look at you the same. You have a different level of protection. I should say some people don't like you. Some people will look at you. Here's the moment when you realize that, with a little girl, your fear one day is not going to have a conversation about puberty. Your son, it's not going to be about the birds and the bees. I honestly wish that the hardest conversation I will one day have to have with my son is about, condoms.
Right.
But instead, the conversation that will happen is the N-word being used, or the sentiment behind him being thought of them. That will happen. And in this moment, my husband with the camera, my son asking why do they say I can't breathe? Or my daughter asking, does it happen to girls too? Or their friends asking questions. They know, they're aware without you even saying things. Ask the kid today, about coronavirus. They'll know what you're talking about. Right. And it's just been, it's a lot of weight on your shoulders. It's a responsibility. It's a topic you don't want to address, and yet you don't want to have them live in a bubble that leaves them vulnerable. Right. And that's what I'm grappling with.
It sounds like it's almost like in a Black American's life, it's almost like everybody goes through a loss of innocence, and maybe in their adolescence, maybe earlier, some way, somehow. But in a Black American's life, the loss of innocence is when you find out that you're Black. Like, your kids are young. Like, do you look at them now and say, they haven't been subjected to anything. They don't realize how different they are necessarily yet, but they're going to. And when that moment happens, that's when this talk you're talking about, most of us will never have to have. I'll have to have it.
Well, my kid, I hear you when you say kind of the epiphany, but I grew up always knowing and loving that I'm Black. It wasn't something in my world that it shocked me that I was different, that it was something that I was, afraid of. I have loved the skin I'm in. I have parents who love the skin they're in. I was surrounded by family who was self-assured and self-aware and still socially conscious. So I didn't have that sort of epiphany, mostly because, in the way that people talk about. I've always known, because one of the things of living in areas where you are one of a few, you're acutely aware, and you either develop pride around it or you get self-conscious. I didn't fall to the second category. But having said that, even with my own kids being raised in a far more diverse city than I was, even with my own children as young as they are, they're already experiencing it. They already hear it. And sometimes it's from the benign comments of classmates or anyone asking about their hair, or, walking places and someone wanted to touch my daughter's beautiful Afro puffs, or somebody assuming or saying things like that are to my son, things like, oh, wow, how old are you? Now, are you going to be a basketball player? I'm like, or a chemist. I mean, I don't, that's
come
not,
on, come on.
And so it's kind of those
No one said to your black son, are you going to be a basketball player when you grow up?
Of course they have.
No.
Of course they have.
No,
of course they have.
Not in your circles.
Of course they have.
Oh, that's
you know what?
so bad.
Here's the thing. You know, part of the battle that I have and we all have is when we live long lives, and God willing, we'll live longer. When we have long lives and you've seen enough things, guess what? You wonder if you are hearing things and projecting onto your children, or you are, you know, seeing something and saying, am I reading too much into that?
Right.
Or what's that supposed to mean?
Got to be constant.
And then there are those moments, but there are moments that are far more clear, and you're like, no, that we're not going to have that. I mean, I tell a story when I was, I had just given birth to my son, and then we talked about I had complications after childbirth, and they thought at one point they had an X-ray and said, you know, there may be an issue with his heart. Could you, just go check it out at this, very renowned, pediatric cardiology department, and just to check. I think we're wrong, but just let's be, overly cautious. I said, fine. I had a C-section. I had just had, multiple blood transfusions. I had, basically coded afterwards, and I was still, very much in pain from the incision and all that had happened. And so I left the hospital, say on a Friday. On Monday, I went to on Saturday, went to this pediatric cardiology center. I walk in pain, delirious, and kind of just like, I got to make sure my baby's okay. And the doctor, who was the head of this renowned place, a white woman, was saying, oh, everything okay? How have you been? I said, well, it's been a hell of a week, actually. And she says to me in the during the X-rays, as she's going through and scanning his body and everything, and she turns to my husband, who happens to be darker than I am, and my son, as a brand newborn, was a lighter shade than I was. Right. And she turns to my husband and says, "Don't worry, it's your baby. He'll get darker." And here I am. I know your eyes are bulging, because that was exactly the look of the X-ray technician who was like, in that moment. And I said, what? And she repeated it, because in her mind, she was either entitled to say it to me, or ignorant that it was an offensive thing to say, or just didn't care, had a conscious disregard for a human being's ears. I looked at my husband, who had essentially just heard somebody imply that there was some question that is of the biological connection to his child, that was, in the one hand, talking about skin shade and color, and was slapping the face, essentially, of a woman who he had just had to carry from the car to a wheelchair just to get us inside. And I remember in that moment looking at her. I'm looking at somebody who is a cardiac specialist, not like 1 year of school, but however umpteen it takes, let alone the head of this. And I said to her, I took a breath. I said, I'm going to take a breath for a second. Is anything wrong with my son's heart? She says, no, he's good to go. There's nothing wrong at all. No, he's perfectly healthy. Congratulations. I said, so there's never a reason I'll have to come back here. She said, no. I said, do you want to have any role in this child's health? She said, no. I said, then I'm going to do you the courtesy of not explaining to you in the moment how utterly offensive you are, how absurd it is that you would have the bedside manner of a dragon demon, as opposed to somebody who would be intellectual, courteous, humane enough to know that a brand new mother and her newborn son are in front of you, wondering if there's something wrong with his heart. And I find that his heart was never the issue, but you instead. I said, but I don't feel compelled in this moment to try to change the mind of somebody who could be presumably smart in terms of books and have no integrity or common sense. I'm exhausted by this already. Goodbye. We'll never meet again. And I said, get my baby. I picked him up. I walked out of the place. I loaded him in the car. I turned to my husband and I said, do you want, he says, no, let's leave it alone for now. I said, okay, well, I'm still going to have to try to maybe file something because, when I get a little stronger, when I'm no longer having an incision that is hurting so badly, I'm happy to do so. But that's the kind of stuff that's not somebody obviously being aggressively racist towards you, but you ask about, in the conceivable, somebody could ask my son and make certain predictions about the capacity for growth or the capacity for what his ambition will look like. A newborn baby was told, don't worry, I think that your father is yours.
That is a rough story.
Well, he's a beautiful baby. And it was a moment and sometimes I talk about this idea and, when people, I hear my colleagues all the time, all across the country saying, we're exhausted, right?
Yeah.
It begins, that's just a day when I thought I was going and scared to wonder if my son was okay. And you're exhausted by the need to educate, and you're also exhausted by the fact that sometimes that someone's educated on a point, they just don't care. The idea of a conscious disregard for human life or dignity or integrity or anything else, that doesn't just happen on a storefront in front of a convenience store on the sidewalk. The idea of a disregard for human life happens in a lot of places at a lot of different times. And that's why a holistic approach to everything is necessary.
Comprehensive, holistic, yeah. Do you have time? We've been talking for a long time and you may be exhausted to talk about the...
Oh, I'm beat. Okay.
Huh?
I'm spent. No, I always have time for you, Pete Dominick. People don't know, it was because, well, first of all, I love Pete Dominick, but also it's because Pete Dominick was not too tired or exhausted to help somebody who said, I'd like to try my shot at commentary, that I'll always have time for you. I'm never too tired.
When do I outlive that welcome? When is that? When are we even? Because I will milk that.
I think we'll never be even, because we're friends. And
I'm just kidding. Help. There's you have so much. What'd you say?
Cookies.
I can send you some cookies. All right. One more question about what the president did last night in terms of ordering the American. I mean, what did he do? How do you even explain the order that he made, the Insurrection Act? There's a lot to discuss here. I know you've been talking about it on your radio show, but if you could just give me a little bit of it here on my show, and everybody should listen to Laura, obviously, on SiriusXM's Urban View. That's channel 126 between 10 and noon East, and on demand anytime. You can listen to it far more robust, and obviously you always talking to your audience is fantastic, but can you just tell us kind of a little bit about what we need to know about what the president declared last night, what right he has, and are we going to see American military members in our cities enforcing his will?
So last night, let's start a little earlier to the fact that before a photo op, someone ordered a code red of sorts of tear gassing peaceful protesters on an iconically public forum in front of the United States White House. And so it's hard to know where to begin with what happened last night, but let's begin with when he actually came out and spoke. So first of all, generally speaking, you're going to hear things like the Insurrection Act and posse comitatus. These are all really one way of thinking that we don't want federal troops acting as local law enforcement, right? We want our military that's trained for combat and for war to be doing those functions. We don't want them ever to have to be in combat or ever have to go to war or defend something like that internationally, but primarily, the military serves that role exclusively as opposed to any other entity. So you don't have a police officer in the U.S. going out on the to try to go in military combat overseas. That would be nonsensical to people. Aren't there better, entities to do this? And so that's all part of it. But so generally speaking, we don't want our troops engaging in local law enforcement. We don't want to. There are ways for the president as commander in chief could call the military to do certain functions. And they have a statutory exception for when you don't want to have the military come around. And that is the Insurrection Act, which is about talking and saying, look, you can to try to quell unrest in some way, and you can do this theoretically. But primarily, there's only two ways it's ever really been done. One way is through a state governor asking for the help. For example, it happened back in the Rodney King riots era, when George H.W. Bush was asked by then Governor Pete Wilson out of California to come and help. He needed help. And so therefore, the rules of normally not having federal troops there went out the window upon request of a governor who'd already tried, I believe, to use local, National Guard and law enforcement to try to, calm the situation. That's the first way. The other way is normally used to justify using federal troops somehow as local law enforcement is when the federal troops are enforcing federal law. For example, Eisenhower sent down the federal troops to try to help in terms of James Meredith trying to get into what's known as, Ole Miss, I believe, was the case.
Integrate the college.
Integrate the college, or to have an instance when you're trying to enforce the desegregation laws in this country, because their role was to go down there knowing full well, as you can probably guess, these states in the South who had these very, very horrific Jim Crow laws, we're not going to just self-enforce. And so okay, there's a law there. Well, now it's there. We better recognize the law of the land. So that's the instance you do so. So either the governor is saying so, or you got this federal law. We don't necessarily see either of those instances. There's been some states already who said, I didn't ask for your help. And also I don't know what the federal law you may be looking at enforcing that would trigger the need for military. Even remember, George W. Bush was nervous about didn't want to send military down to Hurricane Katrina. And they know they needed help. But because he was so concerned about the optics, not just politically, but sort of constitutionally of having the military, these troops go and be on the ground. And even that, it's not entirely clear to me if these laws are able to be used, they would have anything more than a police presence. Could they arrest? Could they conduct searches and seizures? What are the restraints on these people being able to do so? But primarily, one of the things that is almost
it's not clear to you because there's not really much precedent, right? You mentioned the two occasions there in California and Ole Miss, but in those occasions. They didn't have to do all. We don't have any precedent for it. That's why it's not your opinion. It's not clear to you. It's any legal scholar like yourself would have the same opinion because we have not seen this. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And it's one of those things where, in a long line of there's no precedent for this sort of lines we've had over the past 3 or 4 years now, it ranks very high. But also, in that same theme, it's odd that a president who has been accused so many times of not being willing to accept responsibility or take personal accountability of things would be willing to, in many ways, take on either the credit or the expected blame for whatever a federal, military presence would have in these areas. Because if you remove the ability of the state level officials to make decisions about who is going to try to quell any, looting or rioting or violence protests that are very distinct from the ideological, purposeful, righteous protests that are in favor of seeking justice for George Floyd, and not the idea of trying to hijack and exploit for self-gain over here. If you take the reins away from them, then you're the one who now will be in the position to be questioned, blamed, or even perhaps lauded about it. So it's an odd thing that he'd want to assume, which is why he really only threatened in many respects to use it. And we're hearing a lot about different states of what they're going to do. But just a final point on that issue, if my answer here is that there's a reason that you have a National Guard in a state. Yep. When someone says something like, go home, talking to the military, they are home, right? These are local people who are part of their state National Guard. They are home. They are community members. They are the grocers. They are the firefighters. They are the doctors. They are the people who are part of the community. They're the teachers. And so you do have an interest, right, in having people from the community help to quell community-related issues. There's an inherent credibility. There's a different level of trust. There is a different level of ownership and feeling about it, and perhaps compassion. That's different than, the
101st Airborne. Yeah, really good point. The reverse of that is also true when the National Guard was sent to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. People thought this is not the responsibility of the National Guard. They're supposed to be doing, as you just said, handling things on the home front in their local areas where they live. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Good point.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's hard to know where we go from here in terms of what the president has the authority to do and whether or not, the military is going to carry out those authorities as well.
That's the interesting part. What they're going to do about it. I think on the horizon, really probably more on the close horizon instead, as we all try to do these sort of intellectual exercises of what could happen and try to get it in real time, because you don't know, it's such an era of unprecedented action. It's not unlikely that there will be the court trying to grapple with these issues in very real time. There's not going to be sort of the length of time to ponder and be contemplative as the court would like, as Congress would like, as members of the public would like. I think in the immediate future is going to be real questions about what happened last night in front of the White House and whether there is some level of government responsibility or lawsuits or being filed over the inability to peacefully protest, and using gas as a way to
rubber bullets
people and rubber bullets. I believe rubber bullets. And my colleague Jim Sciutto was talking about this earlier today on CNN. It was that there are actual bullets just cased in rubber, right? These are not just like pellets. These aren't
you get hit in the eye, you lose the eye.
Things. Right. Yeah. And so I keep hearing rubber bullets. I want people to understand for all intents and purposes, the rubber is silent. It's a bullet that's being shot at people. Well, so it's just.
The only other point I meant to make there was you said the example of 92 was when California Governor Pete Wilson requested the military. Right. It is my understanding, I read this on Twitter, I don't know how true it is, that zero governors have requested the United States military. They have their local and state police. They have the National Guard, as you mentioned. They haven't requested this help. They understand how politically and public safety-wise that could be a very bad thing for them to have the United States military in their states, and they haven't requested it.
And, just to come full circle, think about this. And I know that George Floyd is symbolic of so many people, past, present, and dare I say future. I hope not. But potentially, he is symbolic of this impassioned, visceral reaction to excessive force and constitutional rights being trampled on. So it just seems counterintuitive and counterproductive that one would use excessive force to try to address an outcry against excessive force.
Right.
And I think this is all escaping perhaps I'm not sure who's running the ship and the operation, but whoever it is, I certainly hope that they're able to look at least the First Amendment and those 5 powers within it, the ability to have free speech, free press, freedom of religion, to assembly and to assemble and to petition the government for grievances. Well, guess what? It's all there.
You would think if anybody, that'd be Bill Barr, the Attorney General.
But he was out beforehand, just surveying, I guess, the scene before the gas went out. It's unbelievable.
Laura Coates, I'll let you go. What a great conversation. We covered a lot, and I really appreciate it. I love you and your whole family.
Love you, too. I'm glad to see you. You look good. Everyone else is kind of catching up to the Pete Dominic beard now. Look at you.
Yeah, my beard is...
It was pre-quarantine.
That's right. That's right. I was an early adapter, and getting a lot of compliments. You get because it looks great on a Zoom camera. get up closer. You're like,
what is your Zoom? What's the Zoom sway you're doing? What's this about? Like, is
I'm moving around, just showing you the different angles
show motion
of my beard.
Is that why you're air? Like, well, that's a great point. I think your point is so good. Good question.
No, there's.
That's a great question. Yeah.
I just thought I would give you a few different angles of the silver fox that I have become.
That's how Pete Dominic takes compliments. Oh, you mean this beard? Oh, this one? This one?
Pete Dominic takes compliments by begging for more. We're not done here.
Never mind. I guess we're not done here.
Thank you.
I'm glad I was with you. Nice to see you. I'll call you soon.
All right. Laura Coates, the Laura Coates on Twitter. Listen to her on SiriusXM. Watch her on CNN. And always such a great conversation. Such a cool, awesome, hilarious, thoughtful woman. And great family, great husband, great little kids, a son and a daughter. And I just love talking to her, and I love having her in my life. Now I'm excited to introduce you to a new guest who hasn't been on the podcast before, but she joined me on SiriusXM once. And she's got a new book. It's called The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. You've seen the rise of the Christian religious right in America over your lifetime, but the form it has taken today and the influence that it has in the courts, in our Congress, and in the White House is terrifying for a lot of reasons that she points out in this interview and in her book. It's a really great conversation. I'm so happy that you're still listening, because you're going to be fascinated, terrified, and hopefully moved to do something about the situation in America in terms of the dangerous rise of religious nationalism in our own country. I think you're going to really like this. Here now is my conversation with the author of The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, investigative journalist and author, Katherine Stewart, right now. And so for today's show, really the perfect guest to talk to is my guest right now, journalist and author, Katherine Stewart. Katherine, thank you so much for joining me.
It's so great to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Pete.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of all your work, and I think that your new book, The Power Worshippers, is sadly relevant and very, very important for Americans to understand what is happening. So talk to me a little bit about generally what this book is about, The Power Worshippers, Christian nationalism.
Well, it's about the religious right as a political force. I think a lot of people unfortunately still interpret the religious right. They see it as fighting the so-called culture wars, preoccupied with things like abortion and same-sex marriage. But really, this is a political movement, and its leaders want power. They claim to be representing religion, but what they really want is political power, and they're cloaking their political aims in religious rhetoric.
For so long, they have used any number of different animating issues, but usually we think about abortion, we think about gay marriage. Sadly, now the latest thing in the culture war that we've heard from the religious right certainly is this transgender bathroom issue, which sounds like they just made that one up, because it's not an issue that anybody was concerned with, or nobody really. It sounded like they almost just created one in a think tank in a back room to divide people. What about that whole transgender bathroom issue? Was that really an issue?
It's really interesting. In my 10 years of researching this movement, I go to a lot of right-wing gatherings and strategy meetings of leadership, values voters conferences, road to majority conferences. And I remember a few years ago, there was one conference, I think it was a road to majority conference. And this is all the leaders of the movement are gather there, and most of the leaders of the movement, and a lot of them spoke up on stage, and a lot of their political allies. It seemed like every single speaker got up and said, we've got to talk about transgender bathrooms. This is not an issue that really came from the base. This is an issue they've created for political purposes, because they create these issues to divide the populace and to solidify their base. And they create these issues in order to, advance the so-called persecution narrative, the idea that conservative Christians are somehow the most persecuted group in our country. They did, interestingly, much the same thing with the abortion issue. I think right now, the abortion issue is become the single issue that unites supporters of the movement. And when leaders of the movement are talking to the rank and file, or when they're talking to pastors about the issues they need to talk to the rank and file about in order to get their vote, it's all abortion all the time. Abortion is the beginning and the end. But we have to remember that when Roe versus Wade was passed, most Republican Protestants supported it. They supported some form of abortion law liberalization. It was Ronald Reagan himself back in 1967 as governor of California that signed the most liberal abortion law into in the country. So,
well, you say we have to remember, but I only learned that a couple of years ago. Like this is probably news for some people that didn't live through it or weren't paying attention, or they're younger and they haven't researched it. But what did Protestant leaders think about abortion before then?
Well, a lot of Protestant leaders supported. In 1973, when Roe v. Wade was decided, a fellow who was the chief of the Baptist Press, which is a wire service run by the Southern Baptist Convention, this is like an incredibly large denomination. He wrote that religious liberty, equality, and justice were advanced by the Supreme Court abortion decision. And his position at the time was not at all exceptional. Southern Baptists actually endorsed a resolution that allowed some form of abortion rights to preserve the health of the mother, the physical and emotional health, and in other instances. I remember that when Peggy, Barry Goldwater's wife Peggy, Barry Goldwater was a great conservative hero. His wife was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. But leaders of this sort of hyper-conservative counter-revolution, sort of a reactionary political movement that called itself the New Right, got together. Its members included folks like Paul Weyrich, Phil Schlafly was a part of it. They really wanted to find an issue that could unite different strands of the movement. Hyper-conservative Protestants and hyper-conservative Catholics. And they sort of had a number of issues that they were concerned about. They were deeply concerned about the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, prayer in schools, that issue. But they kind of went down the list of these issues. And when they got to abortion, it was almost like a light bulb switched on. And over time, pro-choice voices were purged from the Republican Party. And so what you see today is this kind of lockstep anti-abortion stance. And it's the way that they get people to vote for them, because leaders of the movement know very well if you can get people to vote on a single issue, a single binary issue, you can control their vote.
So you talked about you just mentioned leaders of the movement, and what kind of research did you do? I know you traveled all over the country and attended all kinds of what must have seemed like bizarre gatherings, but what's the difference between the leaders and what they think and what they want and what the congregants, parishioners believe, think, and want?
I think that when you're talking about the rank and file, you're talking about a really wide range of people with very different interests and backgrounds and ideas. So it's hard to generalize safely, but I think it is safe to say that a substantial number of them do not explicitly support anything like a theocracy. And many of them would be very unhappy to learn all of the details about what their leaders are supporting, particularly in terms of the right-wing economic policy that their leaders are pushing. So much of this group, they're voting identity and not just policy. When they vote for candidates who promise to end abortion or reunite church and state, or they insist themselves that America is a so-called Christian nation, they aren't actually explicitly aiming for major fundamental changes in the way that American government is organized. What they're doing is making a statement about who they are and what they value themselves. It's identity politics in a way. It's tying the idea of America to explicit religious and cultural identities. But, for leaders of the movement, we're talking about the heads of right-wing policy groups, networking groups, media and legislative initiatives, data and legal organizations and the like. Their vision involves a lot more power for themselves and their networks. and for the political leaders that they support, the hyper-conservative political leaders. Many of them are looking forward to a time when only Christians in their approved versions of the religion are in charge of all major areas of government and society. And when those leaders answer to their spiritual guides, they're also looking forward to a time when they can rely on government for two things. Number one, a constant flow of taxpayer dollars, and number two, policies that privilege their religion, their sort of religions, the approved religions.
Right. Yeah. God, it's terrifying.
So it is really a political movement that is cloaking itself in religious rhetoric. It's not just
Tell me about some
war.
of the people that you interviewed. I mean, you sat down with a lot of these leaders, didn't you? Tell me about someone like Ralph Drollinger.
Ralph Drollinger is a really interesting character. I focused on him in my second chapter of the book. He is the head of an organization called Capital Ministries. They target political leaders at the highest levels of power. If you look at his website, his congressional, supporters in the White House include folks like Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Alex Azar, Betsy DeVos. At least a dozen current and former members of Trump's cabinet are said to have attended or have attended his group. So when I was researching my book, I attended a 20th anniversary celebration of his ministry, and it was in the San Joaquin Valley. And a lot of his early funding was some of the owners of these large-scale agribusiness conglomerates. And so, indeed, Trump's agricultural secretary, Sonny Perdue, was on hand to deliver an endorsement. So here's the thing to know about Drollinger. This expansiveness of his positions on these domestic, economic, and foreign policy issues hits home the fact that this is a political movement and not really a stance in the culture war. He weighs on, in on a number of economic policy questions. He says, social welfare has no basis in scripture, it's unbiblical. In his Bible study groups, he says that the government doesn't say that shouldn't be helping the poor directly or fully support those with genuine needs, or commerce even. He says that the responsibility for the needs lie with the husband in a marriage and with a family, and thirdly with the church. And it's sort of, he, like other political leaders, has no problem with government money flowing to the poor as long as it passes through churches first. He also, according to Drollinger, he also thinks the Bible believes in deregulation. He says leaders must incentivize individuals and industries, which includes unencumbering them from unnecessary burdens of government regulations. He's also against environmental regulations. He's called environmentalism a false religion.
I'm getting nauseous, but it's so important. I mean, it really is. It really is very important. And I think I just want to go back and underscore what this guy and others believe, because everybody listening, anybody interested in this issue, understands kind of the culture wars and how the Christian right has fought for them and how they divided and conquered us on the issues of abortion, as well as homosexuality, sexuality, sex in general. But I think what you said about economic policy and the focus and beliefs that they have about economic policy, that's something that most people don't know and certainly don't understand. Your book does a lot of work, and you did a lot of great reporting here to uncover this. But I just want to underscore that they don't think that government should be in the business of redistributing tax or just distributing any kind of social welfare. They have a completely different belief. It definitely reminds me of the Taliban.
It's very interesting. I think the sort of economic piece of this is really underappreciated. The Christian right has, for a very long time, allied itself with a kind of libertarian, hyper right-wing economic ideology that advocates for sort of submissive workforce. And actually, Drollinger advocates for that too. He actually cites from the New Testament, the first letter of Peter, servants, be submissive to your masters. And here he says that, the economy of Rome at the time of Peter's writing was one of slave and master, but the principle of submitting to one's boss carries over to today, submitting to one's boss. I mean, think about it. This is all music to the ears of these leaders, the sort of business leaders who support the religious right, many of whom rely on minimal workers' rights and economic and environmental deregulation to maintain and increase their profits. It's a very kind of specific ideology. As I document in my book, a lot of the funders of the Christian nationalism today, which I actually think is a more accurate term to describe the movement, they are coming from these hyper-wealthy, often extended families that, so they're advocating for, all this sort of, religion, but at the same token, I think they're just as committed, if not more committed, to libertarian economic policies. I think
they've been able to bend their what they call Christianity into being very much in line with libertarian ideas of deregulation and anti-tax and all of that. So there's a ton of overlap. I just want to go back to another thing that you mentioned about Drollinger and his access to the White House. And you mentioned these cabinet members that have joined his, I guess, prayer group. And what do we know? I mean, I feel like there's a lot of true believers, not just people who are using religion to further their means and make more money. They really believe in some psycho, crazy end time shit. And I would name Mike Pompeo, Ben Carson, and Betsy DeVos. But I want to be wrong. I want to believe that there isn't a lot of proof of them really believing this stuff and that they know better and they're just using people. What is the truth? How do we know what someone really believes, I guess?
It's really impossible to know what's in someone else's heart. But I think we can safely say that what they claim is religious belief, we can identify correctly as partisan agitation. They're using religion for partisan political purposes. Right. And we saw this, for instance, just last night when we saw Trump and his, scatter a crowd of peaceful protesters with tear gas in order to get a photo op of himself.
He also shot them. I had a friend who was there, got shot with rubber bullets, too.
Oh, my gosh.
Yep.
And it was really, and actually, there were apparently clergy who were also scattered with tear gas and shot with rubber bullets or shot at, so that to make this photo op possible. He stood up there in front of St. John's Episcopalian Church in Washington, D.C., holding up a Bible. And it was this sort of symbolism. Now, do we really think that he truly believes in the Bible? It's beside the point. This is a classic attempt.
Right, actions.
Yeah, it's a classic attempt to sort of promote religious nationalism, to assert that Trump represents the forces of Christianity and must be revered as a patriarch. It's a continuation of this identity politics and us versus them.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, and you just answered it. But I mean, just this idea, there's reporting that said he didn't like that he's being made fun of for turning the lights off the night before and going into the bunker. And so he wanted to show how strong he was and leave the White House. OK, we've seen other presidents do similar things, but it was a weird choice to grab a Bible and go over and stand in front of that church. And I think you just explained it, but he was signaling something. He also signaled to the, quote, Second Amendment people last night. And what do these true believers that you interviewed, what do they hear? What do they see when the president stood there with the Bible in front of that church, which is, by the way, a very progressive church? Like it's Episcopalian, pro-LGBT,
You're right. It is a progressive church, and as we know, clergy of the church have been very upset about this. But listen, I think that they see this as an affirmation of everything that they want. I mean, there's an emptiness to the ritual, isn't there? Trump doesn't quote anything from the Bible. I think he actually held it upside down at one point. He doesn't pray or say anything of substance. He just used this church, if any church would have done, apparently, as this pure symbol of partisan identity. And it shows that religious nationalism is really not about specific religious content. This was a purely political form of gesturing and symbolism. And it's a kind of religious nationalism. Listen, authoritarianism often comes veiled in religion. Let's think of people like Orban in Hungary, or Putin in Russia, or Erdogan in Turkey. When these leaders bind themselves tightly to religious conservatives in their countries in order to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power, we rightly recognize that as religious nationalism. And I think that that's what we're seeing today with Trump and his alliances with religious hyper-conservatives. I mean, there's this crazy juxtaposition, of course. Trump is a leader who's so clearly immoral. He's got this long history of doing things and saying things that no so-called values voter would want to claim as part of their religion. But that's nothing new. It is characteristic of this kind of religious nationalism. I mean, let's think about even Mussolini, who was apparently declared himself an atheist before he became the great defender of the Catholic Church. So it's not about the actions or beliefs of the leader. It's really about who they're giving power to.
Yeah, what do they say? What do these folks, these Christian nationalists, how do they defend against his lack of any kind of moral values, the ones that they so traditionally have always professed value, and now we know it doesn't really matter? I mean, he's been married 3 times. The way he talks, the way he acts, his dishonesty. How do they see it? How do they defend against it?
There are a couple factors in play. The first is judges. I've been to one of the events. I think it was in 2018. It was right before the midterms. One of the speakers at a conference I was attending said, "This election is all about judges, judges, judges." They know that Trump is an imperfect leader, but he has to date appointed over 192 federal justices to the federal courts. That's over 22% of the federal judiciary has Trump's stamp. I mean, elections have consequences. That's why it really it's really important to vote, and it's really important to vote even if the front runner is not the person representing the party you want, might not be your person, might not be the person you favored. It's really important to look beyond that. Who are the justices that are going to appoint? The Christian right does that. The leaders they've trained their followers to vote not just on the issue of the character of their candidate. It's really on this larger issue of judges. And a lot of the movement's aims are advanced through the courts. But there's something more than that. I mean, I think it's a mistake to think that all of Trump's supporters are holding their noses or making a compromise or otherwise being sort of transactional about their support for him. In fact, it's an authoritarian leader's clear disdain for the rules that is part of his appeal. Trump represents the lawlessness of authoritarianism. He puts himself above the law. Therefore, he's kind of representative of the authoritarian impulses of his supporters. Remember, this is a deeply anti-democratic movement. It does not believe in pluralism or equality. It does not believe in representative government. It's another event I went to, Ralph Reed.
Wait, just to be clear, you say this is a deeply anti-democratic movement. You mean Christian nationalism is a deeply anti-democratic. They do not appreciate, respect, value democracy, where people go and vote for their leaders.
Yeah, and even Trump has said so on tape. I think we heard him say a few weeks ago, if such and such were to happen, if voting were made possible by everyone who's eligible to vote, no Republican would ever win an election. He said that. But
he accidentally is honest every once in a while. Yeah.
Yep. And Paul Weyrich, who is a leader of that religious movement, that hyper-conservative political movement we discussed earlier, the New Right. He's one of the folks who sort of got everybody united around the issue of abortion. He said the same thing. He said, I don't want everyone to vote. Our influence in election goes down when the number of voters go up. So, look, this is a party that has made race-based gerrymandering and voter suppression a strategic imperative. But they win at elections because they were so unified and so, they really get people out on election day. They really are sort of, in a way, have that over Democrats for sure. They unify when necessary. They don't, divide themselves in endless hair splitting about, this detail of policy, or I don't really like what that one said back in 1982. They unify when necessary, and that's how they win.
Yeah, really important point. What about Betsy DeVos and what has been, the goal for her as the head of the Department of Education, and what's the history of the movement of Christian nationalism and their view on public schools?
It's a great question, Pete. The movement has a long-standing hostility to public education. It goes back quite some time. Betsy DeVos's family was a huge funder of a ministry of D. James Kennedy. He's had one of these incredibly influential ministries. He had a radio show that was listened to by, huge numbers of folks. And he was very hostile toward public education. He published a pamphlet and a sermon in which he just decried public schools as atheistic and amoral and promoting unbelief. This is a sort of theme that has long run through sort of reactionary religious representatives and theologians for a very long time. And her activism in the education field goes back decades. For a long time, she was really committed to pushing school vouchers. And school vouchers, as we know, deflate public education, deprive it of necessary funding, because what they do is they take some of the public school funding, and send it over to private and religious schools, many of which can teach creationism or contempt for people of other faiths and things like that. But then, these voucher initiatives that she was promoting and spending a huge amount of money on proved to be really unpopular with voters, and her voucher initiatives kept getting voted down. Right. So she and her husband switched to what they call school choice, which is a label that conveniently erases the distinction between charters and vouchers. And
so well said. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And then they became, advocates for what they call school choice. And they realized that they could achieve a lot of their same aims through this sort of school choice agenda. But, she and her husband were caught on tape saying something at a gathering, I think it was back in 2002, where they talked about their their sort of education activism as an opportunity to advance kingdom gain, uppercase kingdom. Think about that. That means, advancing the, kingdom gain is a religious reference. And they said, this is the sort of advancing kingdom values. That's what I'm
trying
about.
To think right now of when someone uses the word kingdom and I like it. And I've got nothing, Catherine. I think like maybe something reference to nature,
we have to go
jungle
back to
kingdom.
Dr. Seuss, I'm the king of the zoo,
good call. Good call. When I hear the word kingdom, I get squirrely. You also said something that's super important about. We all know that these people are anti-science and they teach creationism as something alternative to science, which is evolution. But you said they also teach, you said creationism and contempt for people of other religions. And I do have to go back to that, because that's anti-science beliefs are very dangerous, but so are having contempt for people who are other religions, particularly in America, that is directed towards Jewish Americans and Muslim Americans.
And progressive Christians, we have to say. I mean, I think the movement leaders reserve some of their most poisonous words for those who dare to identify as Christians of a different sort. They explicitly decry liberal Christianity, and I've seen a number of folks who explicitly decry liberal interpretations of Christianity in their written materials and their speeches and that kind of thing. They call it. They just sort of label it, atheistic. I think that if you look at somebody like Bill Barr, he identifies so-called secularists. Yeah, let's look at Bill Barr. I mean, he identifies secularists as the enemy, and he sort of seems to have this idea that secularists are out there ransacking everything that is holy and good in society, and his ideas about the role of religion in society are really at the core of his beliefs, and he's written about this in numerous occasions. He wrote a piece in 1995 for the Catholic Lawyer singling out non-religious Americans for contempt, and he echoed these ideas in a speech at Notre Dame Law School.
That's right. That's before he got the job, right?
Exactly.
When he was kind of auditioning. I'm so glad you brought up Bill Barr. I forgot to bring up, we talked a little bit about the courts and Department of Education, but, he is the head of the Department of Justice. And what he says about left wing or secularists, or I don't know if he said something about atheists, but I mean, that shit drives me out. Nothing triggers me more than someone discrediting or criticizing those of us who are not religious or secular. It really works on me. It really triggers me because I will put my values and behaviors and the way I've lived my life up against any of them. Not perfect, but come on. So I'm glad that you mentioned Bill Barr, and now I interrupted you with this stupid rant. Is there more on him?
Well, no, I think you're right about that. I mean, what they believe in is not modern pluralistic democracy based on constitutional principles as they were written. Instead, they're adhering to a kind of political religion based on some allegedly divinely revealed truth. I mean, so much for the Constitution.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the Constitution. I have that written down here as another just thing to ask you about. How do they see, how do the Christian nationalists see the Constitution? How do they interpret it? They obviously have a warped interpretation of the Bible. I mean, everybody does. They have their own interpretation. But what is their interpretation of the Constitution? Because you have a lot in this in your book. And here now is the book again. It's like my live read to remind people who we're talking to. The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. I'm talking to Katherine Stewart. You should buy this book right now. It's so, so important, as she is clearly explaining. How do the Christian nationalists, these theocrats, if you will, maybe you don't like that word, see the Constitution? I thought this country was founded on a separation between church and state, but that maybe that's my wrong interpretation.
No, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, the Establishment Clause, which says, Congress shall, it's basically make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It's the first clause of the First Amendment. It has, which is, as we know from the writings of Thomas Jefferson, or the idea of separation of church and state is encapsulated in those words. As the best piece of real estate in our Constitution. It's the First Amendment of the first clause of the First Amendment. And it also exists separately and just, distinctly from the Free Speech Clause, which is about freedom of speech. But the religious right has successfully conflated the freedom of religion as, in many instances, they call it freedom of speech, which basically eviscerates the Establishment Clause. But, in order to do this, they've really had to control the narrative of the past. They've had to rewrite it. And to do this, they rely on mythologies and outright fabrications of histories. And if you look at somebody like David Barton, who's a former high school math teacher.
Man. He is a bad man.
Party operative. He's notorious for his shoddy scholarship. His own publisher withdrew his 2012 book, The Jefferson Lies, because of so many errors and falsehoods. And by the way, is Thomas Nelson Publishing. That's a religious publisher. But they actually withdrew his book because they're like, we can't publish this. This is embarrassing. But he's nevertheless become an indispensable and ubiquitous presence in the movement. And he's really a favorite with America's leading conservative politicians, precisely because he offers up the sort of mythological history they need to justify what they do.
Yeah, the most influential evangelist you've never heard of is one headline I see when you Google his name. And then, of course, the Southern Poverty Law Center comes up with a whole profile of him because he is someone who is very anti-LGBT, to say the least. I think Glenn Beck made him famous.
That's where he's done a lot of stuff.
He brought him on like a historian.
It's really funny. I call him in my book the Where's Waldo of the Christian nationalist movement because he sits on the boards of so many of its different key initiatives. But, Barton has so much in common with Drollinger himself. He also has argued that the Bible and God oppose progressive income taxes, capital gains taxes. He obviously knows what God thought about capital gains taxes. He thinks that God opposes the minimum wage laws, and he exploits and distorts actually the issue of slavery, sadly, to make his point. He wrote this essay, I think it was published in 2014. It was up last time I checked on his Wall Builders website. It's called The Bible, Slavery, and America's Founders. And he wrote that different forms of slavery have replaced the more obvious system of past centuries. He said the state has assumed the role of master for many, providing aid and assistance. And he's basically calling, and then he said the only solution to slavery is the liberty of the gospel. Now, if this sounds offensive, it's because it is. First of all, he's attempting to deracialize and whitewash the enslavement of other human beings, which is like an unbelievable, horrible race-based sin. Okay. And then secondly, he's actually trying to cast the social safety net as a form of slavery. But we, can't forget that so many people anchor their support for care for the poor, a government that cares for all of our citizens in religion. So what Barton is doing is wrong on so many levels.
Sometimes I think that your training and career as a journalism might make you a little understated. Because I want to use way more hyperbolic terminology on some of this stuff. But between you and I think we're finding the middle ground on it. And I'm trying to not say too much because I want to hear more from you, especially on one more idea and issue, which is the military, the role that the military plays, the role that guns and the Second Amendment plays in the Christian nationalist movement. When you look at the military, they are disproportionately religious and disproportionately Christian, is my understanding. And a lot of them have some pretty weird tattoos and things on their...
I think there are a lot of members of the military who are really upset by this sort of the promotion of kind of the conflation of conservative religion and militarism and patriotism. I mean, the military draws in huge numbers of
maybe in the officer ranks, you're right. And I don't know if I'm right at all, and I would love to be wrong. But I think that you're probably right about in the officer ranks. But in the rank and file, I wonder how many of these true believers you actually have in the military.
I don't know, but I think that the military is very large and it's like very diverse. There are people who come in from all different faith backgrounds and no faith background. I've given talks all around the country on religious nationalism, and many of my talks, there are members of the military in the audience and even some organizers. And some of them became really concerned about religious nationalism because they started to see it up front in the military.
Sure, yeah, they saw it in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah, especially in Afghanistan.
Yeah,
a lot more than in Iraq, but for sure, yeah. I mean, that's what terrorism. Americans have grown, to believe that terrorism is unfortunately, all about Muslims and Muslim religion, and so when we see it here at home. And having all of the religious undertones and undergirdings, they can see that and they can recognize that as danger. What about, though, race? I mean, when we talk about the Christian nationalist movement, these worshipers of power, what about black folks in America? And where does this movement include them or not? Because there's a lot of, obviously, racism, and we can talk about what's happening in America in the past week alone.
Yeah, again, I think for, a lot of the white people in the rank and file of the movement, it's an implicitly white movement. It's, for them, part of a vision that involves recovering a nation that was once both Christian and white. And we saw a lot of this in that. Did you see that video that the White House tweeted out, made with our tax dollars, of Trump sort of striding over to the St. John's Church, Episcopal Church? It was all white men in the group, it sort of plays to this idea of America and patriotism tied to a set of specific approved religious and cultural and ethnic identities. But, leaders of the movement have been trying for a long time to branch out a bit, to include some voters of color in their voting, because they know very well that they're not going to be able to, with the sort of shifts in our ethnicity as a country, they want to win elections and they need to, draw some subsection of voters of color if they want to win elections. And I also think that they're very eager to guard themselves against accusations of racism for a variety of reasons. Some of them, I think, because they, feel defensive about it. They want to deny the racism of their past, and others perhaps because they truly, are feeling repentful. So, or want to repent. So, like in recent years, they've tried to draw in conservative Latino and Black pastors, and I actually attended some of those events in my research. I attended an event in Chula Vista, California, for dozens of Latino pastors, held by an organization called Church United. Their leader, Jim Doman, is someone who really has tried to make bring about a kind of multiracial unification of conservative pastors. we have to note also that he draws in pastors that represent different religious Christian denominations. So people often call this an evangelical movement. I think it's incomplete. It includes a variety of both Protestant and both Protestant and non-Protestant religious leaders, including
that's really important
hyper-conservative Catholics,
yeah,
Pentecostals. I mean, there's a number of.
Oh, they're fun.
Yeah, well, listen. Again, Pentecostalism is also very diverse. There are a lot of Pentecostal religious leaders who could not be described as religious nationalists. And
you just will not let me generalize. I respect that.
Religion is complicated, and
you're right.
I think it's important. But I think what we can generalize about is religious nationalism and how toxic it is and anti-democratic it is and dangerous it is for our country.
Yeah, you said toxic and anti-democratic, and I was just about to add dangerous, and then you did it. All right, one more question, which is, in my notes here, I feel like I've scratched through everything that I wanted to get to, and I'm not even halfway through the book. But I do want to go back to one thing, which is education, because you write about this, specifically science and what the Christian nationalists have been able to message and communicate about science, because anybody can look at our public schools and all of us can argue about what we think curriculum should be and testing issues and all kinds of arguments that we can have. And we can talk about how science is most effectively taught, but we can't argue about the science if we're not scientists. And they are very obviously hostile to science, especially as it relates to climate and evolution. What is the messaging, and how important is the issue here as to how they see science given climate change?
Well, the movement has explicitly tried to cast a doubt on climate science. I think for many of them, it has a kind of they do it in religious terms. They've often cast climate science or as a kind of a false religion. Their hostility to environmentalism is also exploited by fossil fuel companies to advance their interests. But that doesn't explain everything that's going on. They insist that theirs is the scientific view. So they don't see themselves as opposing science. They believe what passes as science what is passing for science today is deeply infused with the value judgment. And they think that scientific rhetoric is being deployed to advance the views that humans should subordinate themselves to nature. That's why they call it, unbiblical.
Humans should subordinate themselves to nature. I haven't been triggered this much. And we are
that's
all
what they
nature.
Think.
We're all
Well, they think that environmentalism is really a false moral claim masquerading as science. Ralph Drollinger calls it false religion. There's an organization called the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. It's an organization that is it's allied with right-wing policy groups, by the way, some of them funded partially by the DeVos Prince families. And they also, they produced a series called, where they called environmentalism the Green Dragon. Think about that. The dragon, what does that represent? A dragon. Does that represent Satan? Green represents the environment. So they're actually casting environmentalism as satanic, as a false theology.
I'm hyperventilating. We're going to need to take a pause.
It's important to remember that there are many young evangelicals who are deeply concerned about climate change. So here again, we're not going to make a huge generalization without getting into distinctions. So I think it's really important to get out the message that you don't have to abandon your religion to embrace or vote for sensible climate policies.
And we are not separate from nature. We are nature. It's all connected. There can't be a denial of that. Mm-hmm. Okay, Katherine, I'm going to go meditate now. And I hope everybody, I don't apologize. Your work is extremely valuable. I hope you win awards for this book because it's so well reported out, and it's a great interview that you've done for us today as well. The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. I hope everybody goes and buys this book because there's a lot more to talk about, and I hope to talk to you about it again very soon. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Okay, Laura Coates, Katherine Stewart, I'm Pete Dominick, and you can support this podcast, which is out every single day with a paid subscription. Go to patreon.com/Pete Dominick for the paid subscription link in the show notes for the podcast. For those of you that are already paying for subscriptions, I can't thank you enough. Every day, I will thank you, and in as many ways as I can. Keep the ideas coming. You're now a producer of this show. You're an investor into this show and into me, and I really value it. I said at the beginning, and I genuinely mean it. We've created a thoughtful, passionate, kind, generous, hilarious, giving community here, and I'd love for you to join us if you haven't already with a paid subscription, and you can be part of our private conversations that we have that I probably end up airing some of these, but I'd love to hear you in them and see you in them and contribute to them and have you in my life. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that you'll sign up for a paid subscription. That is all I've got for you on episode 118. I love you. You are not alone. Shit is crazy, but I'm right here along the ride with you. We'll talk to you tomorrow.